Hey everyone, I'm Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 13 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by Mega and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today's topic chosen by Mega is the question, how do you pare down a collection that has gotten too big? People might ask this question, and maybe it might not be something that you're personally interested in, but I do think we can find some interesting answers that apply to many other situations as well. So I think the first question you've got to ask yourself before you can ask yourself, how do I pare down my collection, is why? Why do you want to pare down your collection? Because depending on what the reason is, there's a better, there's an answer that's more appropriate to your situation. So for example, if you want to pare it down because you dislike all those cards being unused, then you have basically another question you have to ask yourself. Do you want to use those cards? Because if you're not necessarily tied to the idea of, hey, these cards are my collection, I want to find a way to use them for myself. If you don't have if you're not answering that question with yes, then donate them. And I think that is something that you can do. Sometimes there are cards in our collection that we know we are never going to use, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be of value to somebody else. Let me give you a personal example. So I have a couple of younger brothers, and one of my younger brothers came to me and said, hey, I want to learn how to play this game. Can you teach me? Can you show me how to play? And I said, absolutely. So I went through my collection, and I grabbed a bunch of commons that I wasn't using. I wasn't planning on ever using. They were simple. They were straightforward. And I had some sleeves that I had used on previous decks after I decided I want to go for different sleeves. And so I had some old sleeves laying around. So I built a few just casual 60 card decks for us to play 1v1 against each other with cards that were simple, had a lot of multiple cards of the same name. And so that way, you didn't have to learn, a bunch of new cards to play a singleton deck. And with those decks, me and my brother, we learned, I taught him how to play, and I used those decks to help him not only learn how to play Magic, but also learn what parts of Magic he likes and which ones he doesn't like. So I had built, if I remember correctly, I built like a mono green deck, I built a red white deck, I built a blue black deck, and so there were a couple of options for him to play that got him to the point where he knew what it is he liked to do and what, things he didn't like to do. And of course, there weren't any of those big, really expensive, really flashy cards, and when I mean expensive, I'm talking about money-wise, not necessarily mana-wise. But there weren't any of those big flashy cards because I wanted to save those situations for him to be able to grow into the game. So that's an example of where I was like, here, you have these cards, they're now your cards, they're not my cards anymore, you don't have to worry about giving them back to me, they're yours. They're not of value, and that's okay. They're supposed to help you just learn how to play, and eventually you'll get to the point where you'll want to build a deck as well. And then when it came time, it was kind of around his birthday, I built him a budget dragon tribal deck using Kolagon, the Storm's Fury, if I remember correctly. I used that as the commander, and that commander deck was really, really powerful even on a budget, and so I'm glad that I gave it to him, and he really enjoyed it. Of course, tribal is always a great place to start for people who are new into Magic and of course new into Commander. And so that was the commander deck that he really enjoyed, especially because the dragons, you don't have to know each individual detail about what they do. You just got to know they're big flying creatures that you kill people with. So it was pretty straightforward for that. So if you have a collection, you want to pare it down because you've got a bunch of cards that you're not using, and you may not even say, I ever want to use them. It might not be a bad idea to donate them. You might donate them to someone you know who's interested in learning how to play Magic. You might donate them to a younger sibling, saying, hey, if you want to learn how to play Magic, now you have the ability to do that. You might donate them to a local school where they may have clubs and they have kids who want to learn how to play Magic, but they don't have cards. And so you have all these different options for donating. And I'm sure there's even plenty of other options to donate that I haven't mentioned. I can't say I'm an expert in that. And really, I can't even say I'm an expert in this topic because I do play mostly on Magic Online, and on Magic Online, the size of your collection isn't a hindrance to you at all. And if you want to get rid of those cards for whatever reason, you can either just trade them away for, you can sell them. If you're not using them, you might as well get some money for them. So you can sell them on Magic Online, or you can just, if they're not worth anything anyways, you can just give them away to bots that take those free cards, and then they do themselves. They give those free cards out to other players for free as well. So there are already those kind of options on Magic Online. So I'm not really heavily involved in paper collections, although I still do have a paper collection myself. But I do think that's a good option. I'm not an expert on this, but I do think that this is a great place to a good thing to use, right? Donating them, I think, is a good thing. Now, if you decide you don't want to do that, that's not a problem. I don't think people should be pressured into feeling like they have to donate their cards. I think it'll be helpful for some people. That's what they'll want to do, but not necessarily everybody, and that's okay. I don't think this is a situation where if you're not using cards, you know the moral thing to do is to give them away. You know, maybe not. Maybe you have a better use for them, and that's okay. That's the way I see it. I think it's okay no matter what it is that you're particularly, you know, what your situation is, that's okay. So let's say you want to use those cards yourself, or let's say you want to pare it down because it's getting too hard to build decks with those cards. In both of those situations, either those cards are being unused and you want to use them in a new deck, or you want to build decks but it's too hard because the collection's so big. You're like, oh my gosh, where is that card? I can't find it. Here's what I think you should do, and this is what I would do with my paper collection as well. I think it's time to organize them. And the more strict your organization method is, the better off you'll be. So here's what I found was the most helpful for me when I was organizing my collection. The first stack of cards, if you have a box that you put them in, or if you have a binder that you put them in because you want to be able to find them that way, the first page or the first box is all my colorless cards. And this isn't just spells, it isn't just lands, it's everything. Every colorless card that I have. And when I say colorless, I'm not just talking about the color of the card. I'm specifically talking about the color identity. I think that's super important that you organize your collection by color identity if you're a commander player. Some people will organize their commanders separately, but I don't even think that's necessarily important because as you're looking through a card, you know what color identity you want your commander, so you can jump right to that section. Or you might be saying, I want to take a look for cards for my deck. You want to make sure that you're seeing cards that are legendary creatures to go into the 99 as well. So don't want to leave them out in that case either. So I think the best way, starting off, the first way you can organize your collection first is by color identity. Now after that, my next recommendation is to then organize it by mana value. So you have all your 0 drops, all your 1 drops, all your 2 drops, 3 drops, 4 drops, 5 drops, 6 drops, so on and so forth. The only thing I put separately, and this is something that I've learned from Magic Online, is to then put the X drops somewhere else. Anything that has X in the mana cost, because it can be in any section of the curve, I put those separately. But everything else I do it 0 all the way up to such and such. Now if it has Delve, for example, and it costs less, I still put it at where it would go. I don't count the Delve as part of the changing where I would organize it, but I would do it first by color identity. And so I've organized my collection into 7 different color identity groups: colorless, mono white, mono blue, mono black, mono red, mono green, and lastly multicolored. And so having those 7 sections helps me know, okay, what am I looking for? Am I looking for a colorless card that has a multicolored color identity? I know to go to the multicolored section, right? Am I looking for my Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth? I know to go to my colorless section because it has a colorless color identity. And so doing that first I think is helpful. Then going to the mana value, it also makes sure that you have all your lands in one spot where it's easy to see. So you've got your lands at the very beginning of every section. So the first thing you're looking through those 0 drops, you're looking at the lands. But you don't want the random artifacts that are 0 mana or other things that are 0 mana to be just kind of randomly found between your lands. So after you do by mana value, then you do it by type. So you'll do land, artifact, whatever. You'll put it in alphabetical order starting with artifact. Then you'll go to enchantment. I think that's next. No, creature. Artifact, creature, enchantment, land. No, I think I skipped one. Instant, land, sorcery. That's probably what it is. But you do it by type next, where you're organizing it then into types. And then lastly, you then organize it by the name. Some people will organize it by the name, but the problem is we're Magic players, okay? We're not going to remember the name of every card. What was the name of that card? That's like, I think it's a blue enchantment. It's either like 3 or 4 mana, and then whenever an opponent casts like a green thing or something, or something along the lines, you like draw a card. How am I supposed to remember that if I don't remember the name? How am I supposed to find that card? Instead, if I organize it by what I think I will remember, here in this example I said I remember it was a blue enchantment, like 3 or 4 mana, I know exactly where to go in my collection. So, you put this into your organized collection, and that way when you build a deck, and you want to see how many of these cards do I actually have, because some people build decks like that, you can then go into your organized collection and find those cards that you need. So there are different ways that people build decks. Personally, I build them as though I pretend that I own every card in Magic, which I don't, but I pretend that, and I pretend that I own every card in Magic, and now I have the whole history, every single card that's ever been printed, I've got that at my disposition, and I can use those cards to build that deck. And I build the deck the way I see, this is how I want that deck to be. Then after that, I go into my collection, see what cards I have, see what cards I don't have, see if I need to make any changes because, oh my gosh, that card's $500, I can't afford that, and so then I change that card for something else. But that's the way I typically build my decks. However, if you want to pare down your collection and it's already organized, but you don't know what deck to build next, there's certainly already an episode of this podcast. It's episode number 7, where I talk about how you decide what deck to build next. But specifically to this question here with having a big collection, I think you can also build a deck based on your collection. Now, it's not the way that I build. And so if you're building like me, that you can still utilize this method to help push you in a certain direction. So rather than organizing them by color identity, doing all this stuff, just grab all your cards. Grab all those cards and then go one by one and saying, what type of deck would I put this in? I look at a card, this makes a lot of sense in a treasure deck. So I can even write down on a piece of paper, treasure, and put all the cards that I think would go good in a treasure deck, I put it on top of that piece of paper. Or maybe I use a note card or an index card, and I write what I think would go in that category, and I put those cards either on top of it or underneath it or something like that, and I go through each card in my collection, and I say this would go here, this would go there. Now, there are going to be some cards where they're not specific to a theme, either because they're so good they would go pretty much in every deck, and I put that under another pile that I would call staples, even if they're not technically staples. They're just like, oh, here's my Ponder. Ponder could go into any blue deck. I don't have to have a specific theme to have a Ponder in there. Maybe I would say it goes in a Spellslinger deck, but just as an example, Ponder might be an example where it's like, I could put this in any deck. It's a good filler card. And so I could put that under a card called Staples, even if necessarily, Ponder's not necessarily a staple card that must go into every blue deck. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's so good that it's open to being a fair inclusion in any type of deck, or most types of decks. Then you might have another one where it's like, I'm looking at this card and it's so bad, I don't think I would ever want to play it. And it's in my collection, but I don't like it. I'm not going to be playing this vanilla 3/3 for 2 mana. So then you might say, okay, I'm going to put this into a new pile here that just says not good cards or bad cards or something like that. Once you've done that and you see the piles, you can get an idea of which pile is the biggest. And you might say, well, okay, I've got a bunch of cards all over here that are all really good for a landfall deck. Maybe I should build a landfall deck next. And you look through those cards, you see what the color identities are, and you might say, okay, I've got cards of all 5 colors in here. It's a 5-color pile, but there's really not that many red cards in there. There's only 2. Do I really need to build a 5-color, landfall deck if I only have 2 cards that are going to go into a landfall deck anyways that are red? Maybe not. And so you might then take that big pile and organize it into color identity, and then see, which is the monocolor that's the most that has the highest pile or the highest number of cards. You might say, is this enough to build a deck? If not, go on to what's the second color that's the highest, and then you have a 2-color deck. And then if that's still not big enough, then you go to a 3-color, and you say, okay, now what if I do a 3-color deck? And then once you've got your pile, you're basically starting off on the step that I mentioned in podcast episode number 7 of the Eminence podcast, where you've picked your theme and you've even started to get some ideas of what you want the deck to do, but you don't have the commander yet. And so you can pick up from that step. It's like either step 1 or step 2. It's really early on in the process. And that way you can figure out what's the commander that I need to pick for this deck. I personally love more often building decks based around the 99 than I do like basing it around the commander. And the reason why I do that is because by picking what I want the 99 to do, and I don't even know what commander I'm picking, the 99 itself will be a functioning deck. It's not going to be reliant on my commander to be doing things that are worth doing. It's going to be doing some pretty good stuff. And so that helps my deck be more resilient, less reliant on my commander to be able to do its thing, and that makes it really churn a lot better. The commander becomes like the icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. So that's certainly pretty nice. So I suggest doing that. You kind of separate your cards into the themes, you look at the piles there, and that's how you decide what you want to build. A pretty quick podcast here that we could answer. We do have some more stuff we're going to talk about in just a second, but just to summarize what we've talked about up to this point. Your options for what you can do if you have a collection that's too big and you want to pare it down. 1, you can donate them. 2, you can organize them to make it easier to build decks. Or 3, you can then use this pile method to determine what commander you can build next that utilizes a lot of those cards. And maybe you do that for 2 or 3 decks, not just necessarily 1. I think these are all great options. These are the ones I would recommend. There might be other options that I've thought about. So basically at this point, that's my take. If you disagree or if you have any questions or any other suggestions for how to pare down a collection that's gotten too big, please leave me a comment or question at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some of the questions that you all left for me. On episode number 3, titled Are 2-mana draw 2s good in Commander, MTG Orzo says, yes, next question. So I love the way he responded here. It's just automatic. And that's what I mentioned in that episode. That's for some players, these are so good that they want to play them all the time. In my opinion, I think that there is a smarter way to build, but just because I feel that it's the smarter way, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it is the smarter way for you. You might be building decks in a way where these cards are better for you. And so that's something to consider. I like to talk about it from my perspective of, if I were to use those cards, they would be less effective for me compared to the other options that I use over them. So that would be my answer to that comment. Another question here, or another comment rather, Felipe Bronco, same episode, says, glad to see I'm not the only one who is a big fan of Compost in green, as well as its spiritual brother Insight in blue. I have to say these are 2 of my favorite cards in all of Magic. I used to think that they were not good because I couldn't guarantee that they would always be effective. And I think that's a big trap that we fall into as Magic players. If I cannot guarantee that this card will always be good, right, I'm not going to play it. If it's too situational, I'm not going to play it. But I think what we need to look at is either the average or the median play experience with every card. If there's a 10% chance that a card does nothing, and then there's like a 20% chance that the card is okay, but not really that great, but then a 70% chance that card is busted and it's really good, then that's a good card, right? Even if it doesn't do what we want it to be doing 30% of the time, 70% of the time it is doing that. And so that is worth that inclusion. I think Compost and Insight both fall into that category. Let me read off what Compost and Insight what they say, so that way you have an idea of what we're talking about here. And I'm doing all this from memory, so if I get anything wrong, I apologize in advance. Compost is a 2-drop green enchantment that says whenever a black card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may draw a card. Insight is a 3-mana blue enchantment that says whenever an opponent casts a green spell, you draw a card. So with both of these situations, Compost is relying on black spells, or black cards, actually, and Insight is relying on green spells. Now, Compost, actually, let me jump to Compost later. Let me talk about Insight first. If you're playing against opponents and nobody is playing green, Insight is doing nothing, but there is one benefit here, and that is no opponent is playing green. Green is a very powerful color in Commander. It's one of the 3 colors that people typically refer to as the most powerful colors in Commander itself: blue, black, and green. This has been something that's happened for a long time. Red and white have always been kind of, I don't want to say the word belittled because it's not really the case, but they've always been viewed as less powerful. So whenever I'm looking at a card that's relying on my opponents playing blue, black, or green, or some combination, that usually means that if your opponents are playing good decks, this is a good card. If your opponents are playing decks that are not as good, I'm not saying they're not good, but they're not as good, then it's not as good of a card. And so that kind of, it has that reflection there, that symmetry that I like. So with Insight, either A, I'm drawing a card every time someone's casting a powerful green spell in their deck, which is going to be happening quite often if you're playing a green deck. Or, on the other side, no one is playing powerful green cards at all. Either way, I'm looking at both of those situations as very, very good, especially knowing that monocolored decks are very underrepresented in the current Commander metagame. Meaning, with more people playing multicolored decks, there's a higher chance that they're playing some of these colors, meaning there's a higher chance for these cards to be pretty good. Now, of course, Insight's going to be the best when you're playing against 3 mono-green decks, but you don't need it to be the best. You just need it to be good enough for that slot. And so I see Insight being really good, even if I'm playing just against one green opponent who has 2 other colors in their deck. They're still going to be casting a lot of green cards in their deck anyways. The other one here, Compost, same idea, except there's something else beyond that. It's not just saying whenever an opponent casts a black card. It's saying whenever a black card is put into a graveyard from anywhere. So let's say some people have some black tokens, or I don't know necessarily if that works, but let's say they have some black creatures on the battlefield. Somebody casts a board wipe. You're drawing a bunch of cards off of that Compost. Let's say somebody is milling themselves, which was another thing that black decks sometimes like to do. Then you're going to be drawing cards off of those as well. If they're playing a lot of instants and sorceries that are black, they cast them, they go to the graveyard, you get to draw a card there as well. Compost is definitely one of my favorite cards in green. I posted a tweet earlier today, which I guess tells you when I'm recording this, but I posted a tweet earlier today where I was talking about my top two favorite cards from each of the categories that were mentioned in a recent podcast by MTG Goldfish, Commander Clash. And they had a bunch of categories. They were talking about what each of them consider their top 2 favorite cards, or the top 2 cards in those categories. And for green, my number 1 top card is Compost. And then number 2, what did I say it was? I'm kind of blanking here. Oh yes, Carpet of Flowers, which is relying on opponents playing islands, which again kind of falls into the same category. It's a powerful color. Opponents are going to be playing islands. It's going to be working pretty well. And so when I'm looking at Compost, I'm thinking it's so good. It's my favorite green card in the entire format. And so I'm a big fan of Compost, and of course I'm also a big fan of Insight. I have a hard time sometimes deciding which one I like more, Insight or Ristic Study, which tells you how much I'm a big fan of Insight as well. So that is our second question. Let's do one more question, I think. Jerhaven, which is another name here for Breffin, says, it certainly feels like any one card that can readily produce 3 treasure tokens is sketchy. Now, this is a comment referring to episode 4, where I talk about, is treasure bad, fine, or too strong in Commander? Continuing on, Jerhaven says, so like Inspired Tinkering for 5 mana, is Passion draw 3 cards until next turn, make 3 treasures. Side note here, Passion draw here, I think he's referring to Impulse draw. So Impulse draw 3 cards until next turn, make 3 treasures. One case is a mini Rishkar's Expertise that's unconditional, but then not using those treasures and being able to stash them until another turn, and they color fix, well, it makes things happen. I think making 3 treasures is okay, but when one card makes 4 or more, I'm beginning to find Brass's Bounty to be a dangerous card, and it doesn't help that its opponents using my own bounty against me, even though it costs 7 mana. I find cards that accelerate lands that are hard are quite troublesome too for any deck built with the lands to abuse them. Reshape the Earth is a game-ending card. And that was one of my main topics or main points here in that episode, is that when it comes to treasures, I think one of the biggest and kind of the underappreciated elements for what makes treasures so good is that you don't have to use it right away. So it's not just a ritual, it's also something that's allowing you to store mana for a later turn. All the ways that we've seen storing mana for a later turn, they've all been pretty underwhelming, and so we tend to think of storing mana as always being pretty underwhelming. But when it comes to treasures, because they're accelerating your mana, they're not taking away from your mana in order to store it. I think that makes a big difference. And so with those ways that create treasures, even Brass's Bounty, there are lots of ways that we can take advantage of making treasures in a new way. And I think that's why I also focused on cards specifically that shut down your ability to store the treasures. That's what we want to shut down. If we're going to be shutting down treasures, we don't want to shut down their ability to be activated. We don't want to shut down their ability to be producing mana of any color. What we want to shut down is their ability to be stored, to be saved up. That's what we want to really hone in on and shut down with our anti-treasure cards. So great questions from all of those people, especially from MTG Orzo, who said 3 words. Yes, next question. So I really love that. Again, if you want to leave a comment for me, I would love to see what you guys have to say. But that wraps up the time that we have today for answering questions. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. In fact, the question for the next episode will be, is Mycosynth Lattice plus Titania's Song and similar combos good or bad in Commander? So make sure you subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify if you want to get notified of that episode and other episodes when they come out. Thank you again to Mega, thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.